Okay, hi everyone. I'm Rob Alexander, and for a long time I've been working on what I call the universal equation. It's my attempt to explain everything. I've been looking for answers for a long time, and I've been working on what I call spectrum theory since way back in college, and I finally um, I kind of put it down, picked it up over the years, lots of different pieces. I've been looking for something that explains um, everything, and so this is my best attempt. Since it explains everything, it needs to be universal. It has to be simplifiable to where it can be easily understood and it can apply to all simplistic practical stuff, and at the same time it has to work with all kinds of obscure conceptual things that would be way more complex. I'm going to try to explain it. This is my first go around on a video, and this is the first time I've actually outlined this whole thing because it's been a work in progress for a long time. So my goal is to try to establish something that will basically be a universally applicable way of perceiving things so that we can cross-reference. So the idea is that if you can, if there are gaps in something, but you have something to cross-reference with it, and you fill in the gaps, then it creates this kind of whole picture. And that's what I've been trying to do for a long time. I'm just going to go at this just like I am. So here I go. I'm also trying to create a link between subjective and objective reality. In the past, I've been kind of a complete subjectivist. All this stuff has led me to the recognition of some objective in connection to the subjective. I'll get into that. And I'm also going to try and post an outline of all these different images because my drawing is not great. And so I'm not expecting you to follow all this, but I just think better when I'm able to sketch stuff. Okay, here I go. I'm going to start with what I call the occurrence. Please forgive my writing and spelling. The occurrence is what we're calling life or existence. The reason I call it the occurrence is because life has some conscious or subconscious reference to being positive, whereas what we're trying to do is to make this, I'm going to move this forward. Okay. We're trying to make this, I don't know if this is backwards. Okay, so we're trying to make it neutral. Okay, so you have the occurrence. And then basically, I'm saying that the occurrence is made up of variation and repetition. So this is a singular. This is the individualized thing. This is the one, so to speak. If you get into variation and repetition, that is any dualistic concept. So underneath variation and repetition, you can fit this, you can make it binary, where you'd have the repetition is the 1 with the 0, and then from that you would have the occurrence, which is the 1, because 1 plus 0 equals the 1, so that's what I'm doing here. You can fill in time and space. You can add in simple anything. You can make bad and good equal neutrality. You can do male, a man and woman, that equals a person, which would be the singular of that gender. Don't get too hung up on any of these concepts. None of this is meant to be absolutized. It's all a conversation, and I'm just processing all this stuff, so don't get hung up if I say anything. Some of this is going to be sciencey. Some of it will be spiritually. Pick your thing. It doesn't really matter to me. Okay. So to explain life, or the occurrence, I'm saying that life itself is made up of variation and repetition. I'm saying that the variable is the unknown, and the repetition is the equation. Okay? So the variation would be the input. This would be the equation. And then what we get from that is going to be the output when you add those together, or what we perceive as the occurrence. Sorry, my screen cuts off here. Okay, so hopefully you're following that. Then you can plug in all your dualistic two pieces in here. And so now we can't figure out the variable. So if you really get into this, this can be predestination and free will. You can really plug all kinds of stuff. So the trap that people fall into is the absolutization of one or the other, when in truth both are required. So this is balance, essentially, is the recognition that these two form a singular. Okay, they're both required. So you need the input and you need the equation in order to get an output. You cannot get an output without the input. You can't get an output without the equation that converts the input into a new thing. They're both important. That's where dualistic thinking is a trap, because you emphasize one's importance over the other and then fail to realize that the combination of the two is what's required. So you may emphasize male over female, or female over male, blah, blah, blah. Good over bad. Not to say that we should emphasize bad, but it's a concept, and so we need to see that the perception of good only results from a comparative contrast that we call bad. That gets a little more obscure, but it doesn't matter. Okay. So we can't know the variable because it's just that. It's a variable. It's the unknown. It's the unknown. And the repetition is the known. Okay? I'm saying that So we can know the known. Okay? So what is the repetition? And I'm saying the repetition is the equation. Okay? So what is the equation? Okay. I'm saying that the equation is fractal hierarchy spectrum. Okay? I'm saying that these three things come together to form the equation. Okay, if I had to, well, I don't have to make a connection. I can just leave these two. So fractal hierarchy spectrum. We have the variable, it's the unknown. Now we're going to unpack what the equation is. The equation is fractal hierarchy spectrum. Okay? Now I have to explain what fractals are, how hierarchy comes into it, and then spectrum theory, which is what I've been working on for a while. Okay? Some of you have heard of fractal intelligence, some of you haven't. If you haven't, or if you have, either way, you should check out the fractal brain theory. Brilliant guy named Way, fractal mapped the brain in function and form. It's fantastic stuff. total game changer for me, because he applied it to the brain, which all subjective realities have been perceived by a brain. So that would be the equation is the brain. Then you have the inputs to the brain, and then out, well, this is the brain. The output is the mix of your inputs, which I would call your 5 senses, plus 2 more, which would be gut or organism recognition, which is chemical communication symbiotically, that's not you. And then you would have the heart, which you get into electronics and magnetism and all that kind of stuff, but those are inputs. Okay, I'm getting off topic here. The equation. So, the equation is fractal hierarchy spectrum. That's what the equation is made of. Okay, what is a fractal? Everything in the natural world is fractal. So basically, when it comes to fractals, you want to realize that stuff's self-similar and it is recursive. So basically, the easiest example of a fractal, in my opinion, is just a tree where you have the branch of the branch and the branch of the branch of the branch. So this would be fractal level 1, fractal level 2, fractal level 3, and fractal level 4. Each branch is able to basically fit into the fractal division that comes before it. So there's a lot of different examples. I'm going to post some simpler stuff, but basically if you take anything and that's an example of fractal, because basically each one fits inside the other and is similar to the one above it. So the repetition is the triangle, the variable is the size of the triangle in this example. Okay? I hope this makes sense. These are all fractals. Your body is made of fractals. Every tree, it just goes on and on. So you can have fractal geometry. If you've ever seen the Mandelbrot set, which I'll post it. Fractal geometry is where they basically have an equation where they have an input, the equation, and then the output, and they loop the output back in, which coincidentally is very similar to how the brain operates, giving the option for a loop back and a moving forward. So look into the Mandelbrot set, fractal stuff. So basically finger, arm, torso, those would be 3 fractal levels. So all your veins, how everything fans out like a tree, and the roots of a tree and the branches of a tree are both fractals that connect at a trunk. So if you start to get into fractal intelligence, you'll see that fractal stuff tends to be infinite. So the reason it's exciting is because you can do this infinitely, up or down. It will fit. It will always fit. So if you keep pursuing this, you can go deeper and deeper or fan out further and further. So a conceptual example of fractal intelligence would be the organisms in your body are alive, but they're not you. Then you have the brain, that is you, but it's minus the inputs and systems. Then you have the you, the traditional you, which is your body. I know that you're not your body, but Let's just go with the example. So you have organisms, you have your brain, you have your body, then you have maybe your immediate social circle, then you have your town, your state, your country, your world. Those are all fractal levels. Fractal intelligence gets cool because if you have an island, and this is how they tried to measure an island, but an island is gritty. So if you tried to measure an island, let's just say with a yardstick, it may only fit X amount of yardsticks around the island. Okay? But if you take that yardstick, and let's say it's just 10, just to pick round numbers, you'd use half a yardstick. Because it's gritty, you're getting a smaller measurement. Half of these, right? So then it's going to be, let's just say it's 25 yards. These are arbitrary numbers. The point is that the smaller the measuring unit, the larger the island, which is trippy because the island is a fixed thing. However, the smaller the measurement, the larger it becomes. This is an important concept because it's backwards. It's a backwards mentality because you would think that if we're getting smaller, how's this thing getting bigger? And how's it a fixed thing? It's not moving, it's not changing. How is it? It's not getting bigger. Our measurement is getting bigger, which is just basically means we can't measure this objectively. Because the smaller our measurement, the deeper fractal levels we find, and there lies the nature of finding the infinite in the finite. Infinite. Which is just so interesting. Okay, hope you're following this. Look into fractal stuff. It's everywhere. Once you start to see fractals, you won't be able to unsee them. They're everywhere and everything, conceptually. Now, the other thing I said was also, so there's plenty of information out there on fractal intelligence. Hierarchy. All fractals are hierarchical. So if you take this image and you alter the perspective, it could look like this. Sorry, like I said, my drawing. This from above, this if you're facing it. Okay? So see the hierarchy? I use a triangle because it's a clear example of typical hierarchy stuff. Also, if you do fractal tree stuff, you can see the hierarchy of having, you have the same option here. All of the way that we quantify stuff tends to be fractal. So you've taken this split, and you've taken this split, and then we're assuming this is a split also off of another one. If you get into how computer stuff works, you're going to see fractal intelligence everywhere. Because how you structure, like for example, my iTunes, I've got my music, then I've got my maybe folders here, then I've got subfolders, right? Rock, pop rock, punk rock, metal rock. Then I can go and I can fractal divide them off, break them all down in systems. Wei does a fantastic job of explaining all the fractal intelligence, by the way. You should check it out. So all fractals are hierarchical, which is what makes this an important part of the universal equation, because these are intimately connected and can't be separated. In order for something to be fractal, if you have the tree, the trunk, you've got the branch. This is a singular, but it is wider and larger. This could fit, the branch could fit in the trunk. The branch of the branch could fit in here. And there lies the fractal. See it? Okay. The trunk is bigger, stronger, singular. However, the branches are more in number. So there lies the hierarchy, is because you have all the leaves fanning out here, but they all come back to that single trunk. The trunk tends to be wider, and then you have all the little branches. So there you have the expression of the singular and the many, quantity versus quality, blah, blah, blah. Just need you to understand that all fractals are hierarchical, and because everything in the natural world is fractal and hierarchical, it's very difficult to get away from hierarchies. They're neutral. It just depends. Like all these things can be used for good or for bad, and you decide what's good and what's bad. Okay. Now I'm going to get into this piece of it, which is spectrum theory. This is what I've been working on for a while. So back in college, I desperately wanted to be right. And I was studying economics. I wanted a political position. I didn't have one. So I thought to myself, how do I get a political position? I need to, I need to find one so that I can have something to argue for or against. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go as far as I can to the right. And I ended up at right-wing anarchism. Okay, I thought, okay, I can't go any further than no government. So that would be the end of that. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to go as far as I can to the left. That's going to be the communist utopia. I know that now don't get too hung up on all this stuff. I'm not making a political argument here. I'm just explaining how this originated. Okay, so in the communist utopia, the government owns everything. In right-wing anarchism, the government owns nothing. So there is, I basically realized there's no tax here, and there's no tax here because there's nothing to tax because it's already owned by the government. So they can't take something, you can't take something that's already yours. So if everything is owned by the government, then essentially nothing is owned by the government. So the idea was this creates a political spectrum. Okay? Two extremes. This is the important part. I realized, okay, these are the same position because there's zero tax here and zero tax here. Talking about the same place, and I connected the dots, so to speak. So if you connect these 2 points as the same point, you end up with a circular spectrum. Okay? Where there is zero tax. Okay. So with this, and I could say, okay, looking at this spectrum that I made here, there's zero tax here, but there was the division, so there was the right and the left, these two sides, okay? I realized zero is the point of absolute logical consistency. There is no argument here. There's no discussion. How much tax? It's always zero at this point. Okay? Always zero. It's completely logically consistent because the answer is always the same. Therefore, it's on the spectrum, but only as the connecting point that is outside the realm of the spectrum itself in terms of practicality, which is when I realize, okay, this is the point of logical consistency, then this is the point of practicality. Okay? Logical consistency and practicality. So if you ever want to argue with someone about politics, which I used to like to do when I was younger and more foolish, you're looking for absolute logical consistency. Here, the closer you are to this point, the more logically consistent you'll become. The further away you get, the more practical you become. So the right was too little. The left was too much. Hopefully you're starting to see the spectrum. So, for example, I would ask someone, are you a voting Republican? If you're a voting Republican, then you might be here because you're concerned with practicality over logical consistency because you vote. Now, do not think that any of this, don't get distracted by the political stuff, because the point is to understand the spectrum. Don't get hung up on the political stuff. It's just an example, and I'm going to use other examples that show this as a universal in just a minute. So basically what we have here is a voting Republican. The pluses of this position is going to be that it is practical and that it is not too much. However, it can be critiqued from above, from here, of saying that it is logically inconsistent, and from over here that it is not enough. Okay? This is true, and so is this. Okay? So you can critique every position on a spectrum based on what it is not. Every position on the spectrum inherently contains pluses and minuses. Okay? Logically consistent, practical, too much or too little, too much, okay? Let's say you have a very extreme left-wing person. They're going to say that the voting Democrat over here is too conservative, right? See the critique? Because based on so they're willing to not vote for the current Democratic Party because they think they're too watered down. They're not extreme enough. This position is going to be labeled as impractical and too much. Make sense? Okay. Impractical and too much. The reason I say this is because I was trying to figure out what to think, and I'm looking and I'm going, oh, the anarchists here and the utopianists are absolutely logically consistent. They say zero tax. So they can say, hey, there's anything that involves taxation is that they think is a watered down position that enters into legal plunder called taxation, therefore they do away with it entirely. And the critique of that is practicality. And people say, when has that ever existed in history? Which, regardless of what people say, there might be small little pockets of anarchistic communities but those communities still revolved around some type of a hierarchical system that didn't involve ultimate equality. I've studied with the anarchists. It's hard for them to find a practical example of their absolutely logically consistent position actually working in practicality, and this is the reason why. Okay. So then I started to realize that every position, logically consistent, inherently contains pluses and minuses. So I could ask somebody where they fall on this, and then accurately critique them. Here, 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 here. What's the critique? It always comes from what it is, what it's not. But what is that? Where are they arguing from? What it is. Because it is that. Okay? Okay. So I'm looking for universals here. Okay. Then I started to realize that I could apply this to other concepts. I used to work in the field of addictions, and so if you apply this to addiction, I was trying to figure out how to help drug addicts get sober. Logically consistent here, practical, too little. Now we're going to start to get into how this works practically to actually use in your day-to-day life, because I believe this is how brains work anyways. Okay. Let's say I worked with a teenage population of 16 people who were locked up for drug use. Those 16 guys all existed in different places on the spectrum. They weren't all at the same level of drug use. Some had only used a small amount. Some had used a ton of everything they could get their hands on and were already, like, quote-unquote, burnt out, which is like basically brain damage from any number of horrible chemical exposures. And then, so looking at this, when I was trying to figure out how to help people, I'd realized if I'm talking to a guy out of these 16 guys that had not used very much, he had used too little. If he fell anywhere in here, he'd used too little for him to think he had a problem. If I'm talking to a guy here, they're going to think that they use too much. Now, an example of this, for example, like I used to be a heavy cigarette smoker. So I would think, back when I first started smoking, I was not hooked. So I didn't need to quit because I hadn't used enough. Then, at some point, I had used enough, right? Crossed over to using too much. At this point, I was addicted, so I couldn't quit. So you go straight from I don't have to quit because I'm not addicted over to I'm addicted so I can't quit. But you can see the problem with that. So when I'm talking to myself and others about addiction, I have to figure out where they are on the spectrum. If I figure out where they are, if I'm talking to a guy that's here, I need to try to bring him to an understanding of what's coming. If I talk to someone who's here, I have to bring them back to what was and say, you can get back, you can get something back. But either way, I'm trying to bring them somewhere. I'm trying to bring them into the realm of practicality, which is this lower half of this spectrum. This is where change happens. I want to bring them ideally to this point of absolute practical change. At this point, the person has never used, or they've used so much that they're dead. See how it's zero? A dead person uses how many drugs? 0. A person who's never used drugs uses how many drugs? 0. So the point is that this is logically consistent. 0. The answer is 0. How much does a dead person? 0. How much does a completely sober person that's never used? 0. Once they use, they enter the spectrum. If they've only used once, they're very, like here on the practical spectrum, they probably don't need to be treated the same way someone who's here on the spectrum. And you can go around and understand things from there. So I started to quantify my interactions with myself and with other people on this spectrum. So I could start to, it's basically a cheat code that allows you to very quickly figure out what quadrant a person is in and then see the pluses and the minuses. And depending on what your goal is relative to the person, you can articulate perspectives that accurately address these issues. This is how your brain works, by the way, how it quantifies things. On spectrum, however, that's why the brain, easiest is to operate from a split. You can see kind of the brain, the two halves, but you can have the dualistic perspective of good and bad. Well, that is on a spectrum, but it's a very simplistic division, but it's fast. Not much thought goes into, oh, it's either good or it's bad. This is where a lot of people live. It takes too much mental resources to chop this up and say, well, maybe it's not all good or all bad. Maybe there's some gray here. And then if you get into gray, you start to chop up these divisions smaller and smaller. And at some point, you have to make some decisions about what your position is. That's not for me to say, but it's just to explain why some people with very low neurological margin are trapped in the dualistic mind. They're forced to just operate good, bad, black, white. When you get into the gray, the brain starts to have to use its resources to actually think about the spectrum that the thing exists on and make divisions. It went on like this for some time. It was very difficult because, as you can see, there's pluses and minuses to absolutely every position on the spectrum, and so it left me with virtually no beliefs whatsoever, because no matter what I decided to believe, I was able to accurately and consistently see the pluses and minuses of that position relative to myself, and so it got very exhausting. But, which basically I still define beliefs. Anyways, that's funny. See the lie in a belief. Okay. Whenever anyone talks about their beliefs, I ask them to define it, which is a question most people don't ask relative to beliefs, and they should, because if you ever have a conversation with someone about their beliefs, you should know what it is that they're even talking about from the beginning. Define beliefs. I define beliefs as a subjective tool of the mind. No. Sorry. A functional tool of the mind to cope with a subjective reality. Me being a subject, it's a functional tool of the mind to cope. So it has a function. It is a tool that my mind uses. I need beliefs. People figure out, well, why do you need beliefs? You have beliefs. Whether you like it or not, your mind has beliefs. It uses them as a tool, and it is a functional tool. You have to have beliefs in order to make decisions, in order to establish a neurological hierarchy. So people who do away with beliefs completely are incapable of forward motion or motion at all, because the mind does not have a neurological hierarchy to operate from. So beliefs have a functional component. They're functional tools of the mind. And that function is what? The function is to cope with a subjective reality. So those tools that the mind uses to cope pertain to your reality, which is why you can have different beliefs than somebody else. Those beliefs are the tool your mind is using to cope with your reality. It is not the same for someone who has completely different beliefs than you. Those completely different beliefs are doing something. They are a functional tool of the mind. Does that mean they're better or worse? You decide. But for that person, if they're still alive, then those beliefs have their brain has decided that that belief has had a function that has contributed to the survival of the individual. I'm getting a little off topic here pertaining to the spectrum, but it's important to say because I don't want you to get hung up too much on the nature of beliefs. Your beliefs function for you. Now, this is not an ethical conversation. I know that some people's beliefs are extremely destructive relative to others. I understand that. Just explaining what beliefs are. That's why this is dangerous, the circle, as I explained it, because you see the pluses and minuses, and it's very difficult to have any ethical position whatsoever or to know about how to have any progression, because you can literally just go around and around and around and around and around and never stop. Because no position on this spectrum is objectively better or worse than another, which is what makes the circle concept relatively destructive. However, after a few years, I realized, okay, I have this spectrum. I had rigged my brain to quantify things very quickly pertaining to spectrum intelligence, where I could go, okay, I could make it very practical. I could apply it to pickles, for example. I could say, okay, someone who's never eaten pickles, that's 0. Someone who's died from a pickle overdose, that's 0. And I have it here. This person consumes, I could say they consume too few. They just try it. You may like it, blah, blah, blah. You haven't consumed enough to really know. Here that you've consumed too much, you're super fat. You just eat 10 barrels of pickles every day. And I can articulately quantify their position about pickles. You can use this for anything, and that's what makes it part of the universal equation. It's how your brain works. Then I realized, okay, this isn't enough because all these pluses and minuses of all these variable positions don't lead us anywhere. And that's when I added or kind of put a point right here. So this point, and this is what I call the God point. Now, atheists and everyone else who's opposed to this word, you can change it. I don't care. This is not a religious explanation. All it is to say that this point is equidistant from every position on the spectrum, but is none. So it is in the world and not of it, if that makes sense. So don't get hung up on this. We can make it pure science, but this is a point of objectivity. Okay? It's not, just don't get hung up on the word God. Just call it the God point because it gives us a frame of reference where it sees all positions on the spectrum equally and is none of them. It does not contain the pluses or minuses. It is neutrality, so to speak. It is a superior position because it does not contain the inherent flaws, but it also does not contain the inherent pluses. That's where a lot of people's position on God is the observer, the objective position, observer point. Stand here, see all the positions. You can spin in a 360-degree angle and see it all clearly. This God point adds a dimension to the spectrum because it essentially, as opposed to going round and round, trapped on this wheel, you can essentially have some direction to go, which I believe a progression around, but going towards, if you can break off the spectrum and actually move towards the God point with your thinking, then this allows for a superior position. You're still progressing around, but this explains how you can have two people in our political analogy here. Remember, you would have a voting Republican in this quadrant here because they vote, so they're concerned with practicality, and they're on the right. Make sense? But now you have a person on this spectrum here that's very close to the God point. This is a well-informed voting Republican. They study everything about politics, and they come to the conclusion of here. And then here, further away from the God point, you have a voting Republican. They vote for the same person. They're in the same position on the spectrum. See it? The same position. However, one is far closer to an objective based on their level of consideration versus the uninformed who just votes Republican every time. That's just what he does. That's what his grandfather did. That's what his father did, blah, blah, blah. This explains how we can have an incremental progression, or basically a variation, which is the distance from the God point, and you can have the repetition, which is the position on the spectrum. There you see the variation and the repetition, which is so important. Hopefully you see this. I know all this is a little obscure, but this gives us some direction relative to the spectrum. So we have this critiquable thing where we can critique all positions, but now with the addition of the God point, we have a progression about how to go towards something. So we've added this dynamic while this dynamic of rotating around is going on. If you never move, you never consider any other positions but your own, you are bound to the plus and the minus and trapped this distance away from the God point. This is the ego position. It does not move. The consideration of other positions allows for you can end up at the exact same place, ding, 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 and yet be closer to the God point based on your idea of not having an ego, but having an open-minded perspective, which will allow you to see the inherent pluses and minuses, which is where compassion comes from, in my mind. Compassion doesn't come from my mind. I mean, on some level it does, but anyways, you find compassion with the idea that you see a position you disagree with, and yet at the same time you cannot have that position, but you can understand why a person has that position, and then you can understand the person. And then if you understand the person and their position, then you can not have such an ego pertaining to that person. So this addition of the God point and the progression towards it is essentially the ego destroyer. So you can then evaluate every different position, put it on a spectrum, and allow for a consideration that will show the pluses and minuses of that person's position, as good or bad as it may be. Hope all this is making sense. Okay, so that's the spectrum. That was a conceptual explanation. So hang on one second. We're going for a while here. Okay. That was a conceptual explanation that was logically consistent, practical. Right and left, that's me using concepts on this spectrum, this circle. If I take the same circle, and instead of using concepts, I start to apply numbers and systems to it. So I'm going to use a base 10 system with this. Okay, base 10 shows the 1. On the way I get to this is by I do 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Here, 1 plus 0 equals 1. So this is 1, and this is 1. See the same position. Then, so this is 1, this is 1. You connect the dot, and then this becomes the 1. This is base 10. This is your infinite, fractally expressible system that can use on the spectrum, which would make this 50%, 25%, 75%, or you could do 2.5, 5, 7.5, and this is 1, or 10, or 100, or 1,000. See how it's fractal? The 0 just holds a space for the fractal level that this is on. So I can say, going around here, and I can chop this up as 2, 3, or 1.2 point. I can chop this up however I need to make it fit. It's important that you see the spectrum here. Same position. Moving around this. This is how we quantify things. This is how our brain quantifies things. So if I look at this and I hold it up, I say, oh, okay, this is 75% full. And I can get more specific. I can say 85% full. I'm quantifying this on a base 10. Does that make sense? Okay, so that is a base 10, and the significance of this 100, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, infinitely, is that they all 1 plus, 1 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals 1. So see the reduction to 1. It all comes back to the 1, and the 0 is just a fractal holder. This shows a higher fractal level. So you could say you have the 1, and then you have each fractal branch would just be a different 0, 1, 10, 100. You could add decimal points. You can move them however you need to. You can see the fractal division infinitely. So if this is 10, I can make this spectrum in here a 1, and then I can make a bigger one that's 100. That is the base 10 spectrum. Same circle, just explained using math a little bit more, numbers. Okay. If I were to make this gets a little tricky, but if I were to build this, well, let me go ahead and do base 12. This is going to look familiar to some of you guys, everybody, because on a base 12, you would see it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You see the 1 that doesn't quite fit in terms of a fractal expression with this, because this is a 3, this is a 1. We're going to connect it anyways, because the point is that this loops infinitely, this does not, which is why time is base 12, because it doesn't loop infinitely. So you have the 12, 3, 6, and 9. Okay, this is where it gets a little tricky. Basically, the circle is always the same, but the system we're applying to it is different. So we can have a concept, we can have a drug addict, then we can apply what percentage of the drug addicts in the cottage that I worked with were at a specific place, and then we can put that base inside of base 12. Even though all these are the same, the system that we're using for each one is different. Base 12 is time. 12 hours in a day. Does this look familiar? It's a clock. God point. See the clock? Okay. With the 12, it is not infinitely fractal expressible like the 10. It's limited. It's fixed. It does not go forever. Using a base 12 system, you can do, instead of counting 10 on your 10 fingers, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Base 12 gets way more complex, but if you think 12 hours in a day, 12 months in a year, you can see the prevalence of the 6. Anyways, the point is with this, you would do, instead of a percentage, you'd say maybe half past, quarter past, but you're still talking about the 3. This gets fun, and we're going to get into the base 12 and the significance of base 12, but it's important for you to understand that the base 10 fits inside the base 12. So you can think of, I'm thinking about this, my brain is using a base 10 to quantify 75% of this thing. This jug is full of water, and that falls inside the finite, inside the time, inside today. This is all happening inside this moment. This is how my brain quantifies things. It's how I step into time. All the same circle, different system. Now, I'm going to attempt to make a connection between the fractal, the hierarchical, and the spectrum in order for you to see the universal equation at work. If it's universal, it has to apply to concepts, it has to apply to 100% of everything in terms of the base 10 explanation, and it has to apply and work perfectly with time. That's why time works out really nice in a lot of different ways to help us to understand such a complex, confusing thing. If I were to build a hierarchy using numbers with a base 10, it would look like this. I'm just going to do 2 2s, 3 3s to show you the hierarchy. I don't mean 22 and 333. I mean 1, 2 2s, 3 3s, 4. You follow me. I'll post pictures of this. 4 5 5s, 6 6s, 7 7s, 8 8s, 9 9s, and then we come to the 10, which the 10 always is 1 plus 0 equals 1. It ends there. The 1 and the 1. Now, here with the 9s, you have a spectrum of 9s where all these can be spectrumed out this way, but also you see the 1 connecting to the 1. This is a base 10 hierarchy. Each one of these, the 4 and the 4, can be split each one can be split because they're the same position, if that makes sense. The 5 and the 5. So you can draw a line here, have the 5 and the 5, and you can loop this as its own spectrum. Its own spectrum, its own spectrum. Imagine these circles as all individual spectrums made out of numbers. So you'd have a 6, 6, 6 here like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Imagine them forming a spectrum. But then you also have a full spectrum here, 1 to 1, with the 5 in the center. So you see the spectrum here. It's fractal. 1 and 1, so this is one fractal expression, and then you can take it to 10 and start all over again. So you can have the pyramid within the pyramid. Within the pyramid, like we did here. You can basically have this here. All I'm saying is that this would go down like this. So you'd have it here, and then you'd have it here, and then you'd have it here, and then you'd have it here, and this would be 1, and this would be 10, this would be 100, this would be 1,000, and they'd all originate with this initial 1, or you can take this smaller, you can go 0.1, 0.001, see the infinite fractal expression in a hierarchy. This is the universal equation. This is how your brain works. This is how everything seems to kind of fit together in this interesting way. So you can use all the different systems, basically, but if you had the 2 2s, 3 3s, 4 4s, 5 5s, 6 7 7, 8 8. I'm just building this out of numbers. 10, this is actually the 1. 11 11s, 12 12s. Now this is a base 12. This is the base 10 spectrum, built out of math, and this is the base 12. This reduces to 1, 1, 1 plus 1 reduces to 2, this reduces to 3, and there lies the beginning of the other spectrum. However, within a base 12 system, the 12 is the same as the 12. You can link them, create a spectrum here. This shows the infinite inside the finite inside the box. So this resides within the box of time. Okay, I know we're getting super obscure here. But basically, if you unpack this right, you'll see how your brain is able to quantify your existence and how the non-tangible, or things outside of time, are basically having an alternate perspective. You can shift your system, your neurological application of a base 10 as opposed to a base 12 in order to step outside of the box of time and then step back in, because you need to have the function. Your brain still has to operate in order to exist in the practical realm. It has to basically be able to maintain a certain position within a base 12 system, because we are in space in time, and those are the two connecting pieces of this. So you see the clock on a base 12. That's a good explanation, is that you can chop it to where you can have hours, and then you can have minutes, and then you can have seconds. Those are all just divisions. If you were to make it apply this base 12 to something like a deistic spectrum, you would say that you have deities in the practical world. You may have the 6th god. That's what people typically would refer as Satan. Then you would have the 5. That would be the 5-point star. That would be Lucifer. I know some people don't understand, but they're different. This would be the bad cop. That would say, you worship me, and I'll give you stuff out of fear. They exist in the practical realm. This would be the 7. That's why people often say 7's God's number or whatever. This is the good cop that says, worship me. I won't send you to hell. Basically, it gets a little tricky. The Hindu deities, there's so many, they're basically figuring deities in seconds as opposed to hours, if that makes sense. So they've chopped up all these increments. That's a little tricky. This is just a conceptual explanation of a deistic system on a base 12 spectrum. I'm not saying any of this is good or bad. If you'd like to understand the nature of frequency, you can say this lower half is the practical, this is the conceptual or the non-physical realm. This would be 9, this would be 3 in order for something to exist in terms of frequency, optimal frequency. This would be the gateway in, this would be the gateway out. So this would be the optimal point to be in practicality and not outside of it, but also absolutely. So you'd have 9, which would be 432 is 9. That's why the reduction in frequency in terms of sound, if you think 440 would be up here, but actually a 440 reduces to an 8. So it still exists in practicality less optimally. That's just one explanation of frequency using a base 12 spectrum. I'm just trying to give a couple examples here. The idea is that in the conceptual, or if you're open to it, you can call it the spiritual realm, and the practical physical realm, spiritual realm. This would be the division between the two. If you'd like to figure out how to fathom these different things, to exist in the practical, this is the kind of the gateway in. This is how you can understand in math the 3, the 6, and the 9, the significance of those numbers. We can get into Tesla's work and all that awesome stuff. Practical versus conceptual, how to operate on the spectrum. Some people are far more spiritual, some people are far more practical. It's just about, in my mind, it's about this progression towards the God point. Now, what does that look like? The spectrum explanation that we did towards that God point, if you take this spectrum, add the God point, and do a progression towards it, and you add a dimension to this, what this actually looks like, it looks like this. You see it? So this is the circle, and this is the progression towards the God point, okay? It is each one of these circles. This is fractal, because it can go infinitely. It is hierarchical. See the hierarchy clearly displayed. It's fractal on a base 10. Okay. 1 and the 1, 10, 100. See it? Okay, and it is spectrum. And each one of these circles is a spectrum like this. You're just looking at this from above, here from the side. Fractal, hierarchy, spectrum. This comes together and equals the universal equation. This is how your brain is quantifying things. It's on the spectrum. It's on base 10 inside of base 12 in time, so everything you think of. The tricky thing is your brain is doing so many things at one time. Some things you're aware of, some things you're not. And that's why you can have an average. So you could have, for example, your senses, where you can have a spectrum towards a God point. and then a progression of a bunch of different spectrums, all moving towards some moving not as quickly. That's if you apply time to it. And then you can fractal this image, take the whole thing and sphere it out, and it becomes the point on the spectrum, a bigger fractal spectrum. So the average of all these different functions that are going on in your brain, all these different things, the averages is how everything is being quantified. So the you, for example, and this is different for everybody, your identity, the I, is an identity that is made up of identifications. Have a spectrum, influences of all these different things coming together. However, one person has a much more, maybe their job is much more influential than their appearance. Somebody else might have their consciousness or what their memory maybe that's different than consciousness. I know I'm just choosing examples here. That might be what they think of as themselves. But the truth is, so that one person loses their job, which was a huge part of their identity on the average of what comes together to form the objective you in your mind. They lose their job. This creates a huge vacuum, a huge void, if you can see it. It needs to be filled with something. They have an identity crisis until other things step in and create a more balanced position relative to a person's existence. That's just one example of how your brain quantifies the self using the universal equation spectrum hierarchy fractal intelligence. So if you see a fractal, right, and then can you see the hierarchy that is that fractal, and then you see the spectrum, the progressive spectrum. Fractal hierarchy spectrum equals coincidentally this lines up with a lot of different stuff. I've shown you the averages. Here you can see the dualistic positions. You can create like a tree, for example, has the trunk and then the branches and then the branches here. So this comes together like this. So then you can create dualistic connection. An example is a tree where you have the branches and the roots. They both need each other. You can fit anything into this. They both require each other and are connected, and yet both are referred to as two separate things. So this itself is the occurrence, is the tree. That's the singular expression, combination of the branches and the roots. This is the division, and what are each one of these made of? They're each made of the equation. There lies, and that's why you can see the hourglass. If you'd like to see time, you can do base 10, base 10, here's the base 12, base 12. If you can see it, the spectrum here on the base 10, we call it the hourglass. It's all connected by the connecting spectrum, and there lies the X box. The pyramid from above looks like this because it's all connected. Okay, now hopefully I've done an okay job of explaining fractal hierarchy spectrum as the universal equation, and I've tried to make it show a couple examples, but the more that you start to plug stuff into this, the more you'll see. And the important points is that we can start to understand and compare and contrast things based on the repetition, and that allows us to then see the variation, meaning my 3 fingers are all different. They have a variable. They're not the same, but they all have a fingerprint. They all have these knuckles. These are the repetition. So I can make certain deductions about this one based on what I know about these 2, because I have a comparative. And the more things I can compare, the better I can understand. That's how your brain works. So you compare opinions. And so if you know 10 people that lost weight doing yoga, and then you know some people who gained weight, doing yoga, but the majority of people, you would quantify that, do a spectrum comparison, and come to certain deductive conclusions about that, which is why our frame of reference is largely affected by our circle of influence. It's just a position. We can make this a little bit more obscure, a little bit more spiritual, and a little bit more scientific if you'd like to see how that singular, or the one, or source, or God, or this singular point, the unity that we all come from. If you take 1 times 1 equals 1. If you take 11 times 11, it equals 121. If you take equals. Now already you can start to see the spectrum. The 1 and the 1, connect it, draw the circle, you see it? See the spectrum? Okay, draw the 1 and the 1, spectrum, see it? You can go all the way down, timesing 1s. I'll post this, but basically here you can see the spectrum. Here you're doing 9 1s, and that goes all the way across and basically creates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is what it goes down. If you continue to do the math, I'll show it to you. This is the spectrum here, the 1 and the 1, 9 at the center. Connect the dots. That creates the spectrum here. Really interesting. So from the singular, you get the spectrum. Both are necessary to exist. If you'd like to combine dualistic stuff, that's where you need both to exist. Neither one is superior. That's why any absolutization of any dualistic concept destroys the other thing. Meaning, if you that's the whole yin-yang thing, where if you completely remove and absolutize the black from the white, you'll cease to have either one. It gets really interesting, and you can really apply this in a lot of different ways. If you had all women or all men, we would cease to exist because we wouldn't be able to procreate. I know there's modern science and all that type of stuff, but don't miss the point. It's just that all these different things require balance. Balance to be understood. A simple hierarchical fractal expression of 1s and 0s would be 1. You can just go across and you can see the fractal hierarchical division, and they're all 1s, and these are just placeholders to create the divisions there. That's 1s and 0s. You're just getting binary. Binary is the dualistic, so you need the 1, but then you need the place. You need the 1, but then you need the placeholder to create. So you need space and time in order to exist. They need to have both the space and time in order to perceive things. Also really interesting. The other interesting thing is if you take Fibonacci, which if you're not aware of that, then look it up. 2, 3, 13, 34, 55. This is a Fibonacci expression where you do 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, so on and so forth. You find this everywhere in nature. It's pretty fantastic. Look into it. But this, the 5 plus 5 equals 10 equals 1. Here's lies the 1. Then you have the Fibonacci hierarchy, so you can do this 1, 2 2s, 3 3s, and so on, and you create this Fibonacci expression. The interesting thing about that, if you wanted a way of understanding this conceptual progression towards the God point, of how that looks in terms of math or numbers, if you had a spectrum here on time, 3, you would break the door. Let's see if this is spiritual or conceptual. I don't care which word you use. Don't argue over it. Doesn't matter. And this is the practical, physical. To break into the door, it would be 3, and it becomes visible at 3.14 pi. The progression enters at pi and then holds to a Fibonacci ratio towards the God point. At 3.14, the ratio that it takes is a Fibonacci spiral. So if you'd like to see how nature or the spiritual or conceptual progression that you make towards the God point using mathematical concepts, this would be the door, would be at the 3 into the practical world, and then that practical expression would take a Fibonacci spiral if it was on a progression towards the God point. Then you see the Fibonacci spiral that you see everywhere in nature, and it fits perfectly. So I'm saying that the spiral is Fibonacci, but it's made of pi, the infinite number string. So it gets really interesting because Fibonacci is base 10, and then Fibonacci is base 10 pi. We're going to call 12 because it just goes on forever. So this is the progression. The actual line itself is made of pi, but the ratio that the pi line takes is Fibonacci. If you want to get really tricky and obscure with it, it's just kind of fun to see how these different things fit together to allow us to visualize and conceptualize all these different things. So you can do the math on this, and I can show you. You can make it as a circular expression, so you can do it both this way and this way. That gets really tricky and interesting. Some people are into sacred geometry. I just call it geometry. Shapes are shapes. Here is the number progression of what the pi hierarchy or this Fibonacci hierarchy looks like. There's a bunch of other things, but basically if you look at pi, and here's kind of an example of how the number spiral takes a Fibonacci ratio. So we're just combining space and time. If you want to get a little obscure too, you can think about all of the spiritual teachings of people being trapped in the reincarnation, or trapped on the wheel, just looping back over and over and over again. That would be just progressing around. They have not engaged in the spiritual path that progresses them towards the God point. You don't have to do any of this stuff. You can just make it pure science and pure brain science if you'd like. The nice thing is that your brain is a fractal, and it deals with this hierarchy in terms of if you see the brain, and this is the fringes out here, the leaves of the tree, so to speak, your topographical, your higher, but then your subconscious mind, then your kind of the three levels of the brain here. The reason this is universal and it is because if you're disagreeing with it, you are utilizing the universal equation to formulate a disagreement to oppose it, which is why I can trust it as universal. You can take this way further. And if you did, what I would like to do is to make this really open to attempt to try to get some people that are true mathematicians to really unpack this at a deeper level and actually develop the equations mathematically where we could convert that math, plug it into a computer equation and have those numbers be associated with notes and make it musical to where we could convert the equation, the universal equation, into sound, and then use sound to create frequency, or basically form, to see what those geometric shapes would look like if you did a speaker with the sand. These are all projects that I think could come from this. The nice thing is that if you really can understand this, and I know I've packed a lot into this explanation, but if you start to look, every person that you see, you'll see their brain, you'll see the fractal hierarchy spectrum, you'll be able to see the averages of their thoughts. It'll remove the ego. It'll allow you to understand how people are quantifying and subjectively perceiving their realities. But every reality has been perceived by a brain. So the repetition is the brain, the variation is the type of brain, and the wiring of the brain is different for each person. So we're both unique and the same at the same time. The absolutization of either one is an error. I hope this has been helpful. It's been, well, I would like to have more and more discussions, and I would like to present this in a way, because I think that I haven't found anything that doesn't quite fit this universal equation if I explain it properly. So this is my first effort at putting it out there. It may not be of interest. It can be applied very practically. So if you'd like to understand very practical things like how to do better at your job, how to understand people, how to understand your family, how to gauge where a person is at a particular time, you can quantify them on a spectrum, see the pluses, see the minuses of their position. It's been super beneficial in my life for me to be able to see all these different things. And then basically in my life, I can see myself when I get too far into my head, too conceptual. I need to move towards practicality, and when I get too practical, I need to move towards logical consistency. And by basically this motion, it allows me to expand and contract very quickly, because I have a visualizable grid to plug these things into very, very quickly to understand things that I can cross-reference. So if I understand how a cell works, and I can understand a cell being, the body being made up of cells, then I can understand how the body works. If I understand how my body works, I can understand how populations work, and it's all scalable because it's fractal. And you see the hierarchy, and that's why you can see all of the ancient esoteric teachings. If you're into that kind of thing, you can start to see the concepts, you can see the symbolism, you can see the eye at the top of the pyramid in the Fibonacci expression is really interesting. If you're into all of the different stuff, there's a lot of, if you get into, I don't want to go too far, but if you're looking at geometric shapes or numbers, different religious perspectives. If you want to understand where someone is in terms of their religious perspective, you can gauge it on a thing in terms of being liberal or conservative, and then you can have them being logically consistent and practical. So this is a practicing person. This is where they live in a cave because they're so extreme, and this person doesn't practice at all. Neither one are affecting practical society because they're outside of it. You can gauge it all. It's very quick. You can just quantify things very, very fast. You can use it to understand frames of reference with your children or family members. The nice thing is that it really is an ego destroyer. It doesn't allow you to feel superior even though it establishes the hierarchy. If you see the hierarchy, you may be here, but you see the connection between the one and the one, and then you see that you're both here, but then at the same time, with an alteration of perspective, you're the same point. The same point as the other person, doing the same thing, both in the same place. And that's why if two people are there at the same place, it's difficult to call one ultimately superior than the other. Okay, that's enough. So I hope this has been helpful. All right.